Hello and welcome. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories of the hour. Nearly 127 million voters head to the polls in Bangladesh, a key test of democracy after Sheikh Hasina was ousted in a 2024 student-led uprising. The race pits the BNP against a Jamaat-e-Islami-led coalition as voters also decide on a new national charter. Police say an 18-year-old woman killed her mother and stepbrother before opening fire at her former school in Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. 9 people, including the suspect who died by suicide, are dead in one of Canada's deadliest mass shootings. The motive is unknown. President Trump says talks with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu produce no definitive agreement on Iran. Netanyahu says Israel's security must be protected and signals no clear US commitment to expand talks beyond Iran's nuclear program. Furthermore, Prime Minister Netanyahu says Israel joins President Trump's Board of Peace during talks in Washington. Images show Netanyahu signing the accession document after meeting Secretary of State Marco Rubio. An advisor to Iran's supreme leader says Tehran will not compromise on its missile capabilities amid ongoing talks with the United States. Ali Sham Khani calls the missile program non-negotiable during events marking the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. Pro-Palestinian protesters rally in Melbourne on the final day of Israeli President Isaac Herzog's visit after clashes in Sydney and demonstrations in Canberra. Protesters unite across the country as Prime Minister Anthony Albanese hosts the visit following a deadly Sydney shooting. The US House votes 219 to 211 to reject Donald Trump's tariffs on Canadian goods, with 6 Republicans joining Democrats in a rare rebuke. The measure now moves to the Senate but faces a likely presidential veto if it reaches the White House. WhatsApp says Russia attempts to fully block the messaging app in a move that could affect up to 100 million users. The company claims the move is aimed at pushing people towards a state-controlled rival service. Ukrainian officials say Kiev is under a massive Russian missile attack, with explosions reported and buildings hit across the capital. Emergency teams are deployed and no casualties are so far reported. Those are the headlines. We start this hour, however, with some breaking news, and Russia has launched a major overnight assault on Ukraine, firing 24 ballistic missiles, 1 cruise missile, and 219 drones. Ukraine's Air Force reports that 16 missiles and 197 drones were intercepted by air defense units. The cities of Kyiv, Kharkiv, Dnipro and Odessa were the main targets of the attack. We'll bring you all the updates coming out of Ukraine as soon as we get them here on NewsX World. But now we move to our top story of the hour and the ongoing negotiations between the United States and Iran. Washington and Tehran appear ready to compromise to secure a nuclear deal, but expanding negotiations to include Tehran's ballistic missile program could lead to conflict. Turkey's Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan has warned. Fidan told it is positive that the US seems willing to allow limited uranium enrichment within clearly defined boundaries. The US and Israel have said talks should cover both Iran's nuclear program and its missile capabilities. Iran, however, has rejected linking the two issues in negotiations. Peter Baum joins us now, the editor of the Weekly Blitz. He joins us live from London. Peter, Thank you very much for joining us, first of all. But second of all, how remarkable is it that these talks have indeed got to this stage, particularly post that meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, where it was predicted that Israel was going to highlight a hardline stance to Donald Trump. He initially went into these talks not wanting to separate the Iranian-supported proxies to the Iranian missile program from that nuclear enrichment program. However, it seems to have happened. The United States is opening to negotiating the Iranian nuclear program on its own without discussing those other issues. What are your thoughts on how this has developed?
Yeah, I don't think too much emphasis should be placed on the positive news here, Thomas. The stalling of the negotiation process suits both sides. Let me explain why. The Iranians are ill prepared for conflict with the United States, and the United States are preparing for conflict but aren't quite ready yet because all their military capabilities and hardware are not yet in place. So stalling the negotiation actually suits both sides, as I've said. Now, Trump's red lines, despite the comments coming out from the White House and the Iranians, remain in place. Those red lines are certainly for non-enrichment of uranium, for ballistic missile production to cease, for the Iranians to stop arming and funding their proxies, and for the Iranians to stop the atrocities being committed on domestic opposition. I don't think Trump has changed that position, but is being very diplomatic in his wording of leaving the door open. However, the political analysts are suggesting, as I've said just now, that by stalling the negotiations, both sides are actually suited by this. We will see in approximately 1 week's time, given that there's yet another aircraft carrier on its way to the region, we will see in about 1 week's time whether this, how flexible either side is in the negotiation process and how far they will go to comply with each other's requests. At the moment, I think Trump is playing, as he did in the before he bombed Iran, is playing a very cagey diplomatic game and is leaving the door open, or seems to be leaving the door open diplomatically. But I wouldn't place too much emphasis on how positive an outcome will be going forward.
My point was that these two sides are continuing to negotiate despite how far they seemed apart going into these Muscat rounds. However, on the topic of enrichment, the Turkish foreign minister has said that the US is ready to allow limited uranium enrichment within clearly defined boundaries. This was something that was completely off the table before in those previous rounds back in March. Why the breakthrough on that now if the Turkish foreign minister is indeed reporting the correct information?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the Turkish foreign minister is reporting the correct information. Now, Turkey's role here is very interesting. I think I was being interviewed by yourself just before the first round of the negotiations was supposed to take place in Turkey, if you remember, and the Iranians moved that to Oman. Now, why? At the time, we couldn't gather sufficient information as to what actually happened. But since that time, we understand that Turkey upset the Iranians because of Turkey's support for the board of peace with Trump, in which Turkey not only wants to be engaged, but also wants a role for her peacekeeping force. Turkey sees that there are economic benefits to be gained by joining Trump's board of peace. Iran were apoplectic at this and decided to move the talks to isolate Turkey from them indeed and have the talks in Oman. Now, Turkey realising what a faux pas she made in upsetting the Iranians, are now trying to re-engage with them and are trying to make diplomatic noises and statements that give the Iranians some hope for flexibility in the negotiation process. However, this has upset the Trump administration because Trump wants to retain those four red lines, as I've mentioned before, whilst leaving the statements, the political statements, wide enough to give the world at large some cause for hope that there will not be conflict. But I assure you, Thomas, the United States will continue to stand by those four red lines, as I call them, regarding the negotiation process. Netanyahu, who's been at the White House recently, must be seen, despite his cause for concern, must be seen to keep pushing Trump to adhere to those red lines. And whilst the world at large thinks that there is some kind of gulf between them, I assure you, Thomas, that the United States and Israel are both committed to seeing the downfall of this Iranian regime.
Okay, Peter, do stay with us as we turn over to our next story. We head over to the United States, and a newly released FBI document suggests US President Donald Trump called the Palm Beach police chief in 2006, saying everyone has known about Jeffrey Epstein's behavior. The interview with former police chief Michael Reiter claims Trump praised the investigation and said he had thrown Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago. He reportedly also described Ghislaine Maxwell as Epstein's operative and evil. Trump has consistently denied knowledge of Epstein's crimes, saying he broke ties around 2004. The White House says the call may or may not have happened and stands by Trump's account that he removed Epstein from Mar-a-Lago. Maxwell, serving a 20-year sentence for recruiting underage girls for Epstein, recently testified before Congress, but refused to answer questions, invoking the Fifth Amendment. The document adds renewed scrutiny to what Trump knew about Epstein and when. That is an unfolding saga. We'll continue to bring you all of it. But now we turn down under, and Israel's President Isaac Herzog says anti-Semitism in Australia is frightening, speaking at the end of his visit amid protests and heightened security. The comments come as demonstrations continued during the president's visit, with pro-Palestinian protesters gathering in several cities. In Melbourne, police are investigating after death to Herzog Graffiti was found at Melbourne University, raising fresh concerns over hate speech and campus safety. Australian authorities have condemned anti-Semitism, saying that such acts have no place in the country as debate continues over free speech and public protest. Joining us once again is Peter Baum. Peter, is this an isolated flare-up during a controversial visit for the Israeli Prime Minister? Of course, he is there visiting the site of the Sydney Bondi attacks, showing solidarity with the Jewish community there amidst a wider tour of the country. What were your thoughts on these protests and the greeting that Herzog received from the Australian people?
Yeah, indeed. Well, I know Australia very well, Thomas, having close family there and having visited the country a number of times. Since the events of October the 7th, the Australian government and the vast majority of the Australian media have adopted an agenda which is consistently demonising the Jewish state of Israel, has facilitated and encouraged anti-Zion, anti-Semitism, and these protests during President Herzog's visit was to be expected. I think Herzog has been very, very brave in going there in the knowledge that he was going to be subjected to the kind of disgraceful protests that have happened, sharing, consolidating Israel's stance with the Jewish community out there.
Peter,
it was a very, very brave thing to do.
Peter, of course, would you say that the Australian people shouldn't be protesting against a leader of a state that they think has committed atrocities in the Gaza Strip? Would you say they don't have the right to do such a thing?
Not at all. They certainly have the right to protest. But isn't it ironic, Thomas, that the Australians, which is a colonial project, as we all know, recently passed a referendum, I think in October 24, denying equal rights to the indigenous peoples of Australia. Arabs and Muslims in Israel have more equal rights in civic society than indigenous peoples do in Australia. So it's quite ironic that a country which was a colonial and racist project should protest against the Israeli president. Of course they have the right, but it's fueled not by pro-Palestinianism, but more by anti-Semitism.
Well, of course, that's widely disputed, Peter, but do you think incidents like this strain bilateral relations between Israel and Australia? How would you assess them now? Of course, we saw a sparring match, if you will, by that of Netanyahu and Albanese straight after the Australian recognition of a Palestinian state or the announcement to do so. How do you assess their bilateral relations now? Of course, following that recognition and following the terrible attack in Bondi, of course.
Yeah, bilateral relations are very strained at the moment. There's no doubt about it. There's still trade going on between the two countries, and there's still connectivity when it comes to geopolitical security. Of that, the Australians, equivalent of the Secret Service, and the Israeli Mossad work together very closely. So, and as I say, import and export products are still going on. Now, we've seen what can happen should there be a change of government in either country, whether Netanyahu goes or whether Albanese goes, and damaged relations can be repaired very quickly. But for the moment, as you quite rightly identify, relations are strained. Israelis are being targeted in Australia, and as long as the Albanese government adopts its agenda, and as long as the vast majority of the Australian press, although there has been pushback recently, continues on demonising Israel, that will further encourage and facilitate the kind of anti-Jewish protests that we've seen in the main cities in Australia recently.
Peter Baum there. Thank you very much for joining us, Peter. Great to speak to you, as always. We turn over to our next story now, and China's Commerce Ministry has warned Mexico to reconsider imposing tariffs, stating it would take steps to protect its interests. However, no countermeasures have been taken so far. On the other hand, China's top automaker, BYD, has expressed interest in establishing a factory in Mexico in 2024. However, concerns over potential technology leaks to the US have delayed the approval process. These discussions occur as US Trade Representative Catherine Tai, along with officials from Mexico and Canada, prepares to review their free trade agreement by July the 1st. The US has indicated it may push for stricter rules on Chinese origin goods to prevent Chinese firms from using Mexico as a base for exports. Joining us to discuss this is Dr. Ajay Jua, a former Secretary of Commerce and senior economist. He joins us live from New Delhi. Thank you very much for joining us here on the program. Is Mexico here walking a tightrope between Washington and Beijing, and what's your assessment of how it's performing?
Thank you for having me in this discussion. I'm under the impression that Mexico, at one point of time, as we know, had Mexico had China as its second highest trading partner, just after the US. But it doesn't want to really give up on trading with the US, its largest partner, with which its trilateral agreement, Canada, US, and Mexico, has come up for review, as you mentioned, and it's due for replacement or a revisit before July 26. The US wouldn't like Mexico to have close relationships with China, and certainly would like to have its tariffs in alignment with what the US has proposed. So President of Mexico, she had proposed a 35% tariff on goods coming from China, thousands of goods, including auto components, one of the largest producers of which is China. Chinese have certainly not liked the idea. This was mentioned to them yesterday and the day before when the negotiations or the first set of discussions took place in Beijing between the two countries. But the Chinese have, realizing that there is some pressure upon Mexico, have been actually easing up. They are going easy on the proposal to set up the BYD car plant in Mexico. They have not really followed it up, particularly as they fear that some of the EV confidentialities, so-called EV making secrets, might get leaked to the US. And the US is a big market for EVs, which China would like to deal with on its own. That is why also the rules of origin, which are being prescribed by the US on what happens in Mexico. On the whole, I think that going forward, China would want to trade with Mexico, but on its own terms, and Mexico finds itself in a tight position because for it, it's more convenient to trade under the trilateral agreement, which it has had for several years, with across the border United States rather than a distant Chinese. But in the past, the US is very right. China has been using Mexico for entry port trade. That means goods coming from China, reassembled, repacked, were going to the US, and US would see that as bypassing the tariff arrangements which it has with the China.
Dr. Dewar, thank you so much for joining us and providing that explanation here on NewsX World. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. We now have to move on, however, and for our next story, we head to the US once again, and federal prosecutors have released body cam footage in the case of Marimar Martinez, a Chicago woman who was shot multiple times by a Border Patrol agent last fall. The footage, along with other documents, challenges the Department of Homeland Security's account, which claimed Martinez rammed the agent's vehicle. Let's take a look at the footage shared by federal prosecutors.
It's something bitch. Oh, you want that better? All right, it's time to get aggressive because they're trying to box us in. Watch out. All right, we're going to make contact and we're boxed in. We are boxed in. All
right, we're fine now. All right, out of the car.
Be advised, we've been struck. Get out. Don't you move.
The video suggests the agents could have struck Martinez's car themselves. The incident occurred in October the 4th of last year when Martinez, a Montessori schoolteacher, was following the agents to warn residents of their presence. After the collision, Border Control agent Charles Exum fired 5 shots at Martinez. Martinez now plans to file a lawsuit after charges against her were dropped, and the DHS continues to label her as a domestic terrorist. Let's listen in to what the attorney for Marima Martinez, Michael Gallagher, had to say on the issue.
This agent should be off the streets. I believe he should be criminally prosecuted. We have none of those powers. We can hold them accountable monetarily, and we'll be asking for damages in the tens of millions of dollars when we do get our day in court.
Colonel Sanjeet Sirohi joins us now, an international relations and defence expert, joining us live from New Delhi. The Department of Homeland Security has been under much scrutiny over how its agents have interacted with certain members of the American public. This is a case in many. What more can you tell us about this one specifically, and the broader relationship with its attitude towards alleged misconduct by its agents?
Thank you, Thomas, for having me on your listening channel. Now, this has been going on for quite some time, and I think what I can say about all this thing, what is happening is this is high-handedness of the agents, the federal agents. The language, what they are using is totally deplorable. And what they are trying to do, they are calling them domestic terrorists. I call them state-sponsored terrorists. Because the way they are conducting themselves, they are saying that their vehicle was ambushed. I don't understand, if the other person is not having a weapon, how can their vehicle be ambushed? And when they are saying that she was impeding their agents. Now, I don't understand, if she was trying to ambush or she was trying to ram their vehicle, then when they came out, why did they fire at her? And that the person who fired, I think his name is Epstein, and he is showing his great by saying that I am a great marksman and I have fired 5 rounds and she had a 7 hole. So I think this is totally rubbish, and what they are trying to do, every time they had killed 2 earlier people like Rani Good and Alexei Pretty, and in Alexei Pretty case also they have said that it was in case of self-defense. I don't understand, if a lady is driving a vehicle, how can it be a self-defense, and why should they fire on her? And later on, when it was checked, they had got their vehicles repaired before even the defense people could go and inspect the vehicle. So I think there is totally chaos, and there is something wrong with these federal agents who are working, and who is instructing them, who is giving them the orders. It has to be checked and it has to be verified. Thomas.
Yes, and of course the Department of Homeland Security, led by Kristi Noem, do you see them, after all the past controversies, taking a step back in their approach? This of course follows the killing of 2 individuals in Minneapolis, among other previous less severe incidents like this one. Do you see them going forward, rethinking their strategy?
They should have done long time back, and I have been on your channel on this issue number of times, and I have said that their approach, their intention may be correct, but their approach to handle these situations is totally incorrect. And I again say that the way the federal agents are working, I think they are working as a terrorist. They are calling the normal citizens of the country as domestic terrorists. I call them, they are the state-sponsored terrorists, and they are behaving in such a manner that they don't belong to this country, the way they are conducting themselves. And I think the federal agents must be guided, and they must be counseled, and they must be reprimanded for their actions at the earliest, so that the message goes to all other federal agents who are getting involved in all these things, and they are firing in self-defense and firing 5 rounds. You don't fire 5 rounds in self-defense, you fire only 1 or 2 rounds, and those rounds are fired in the leg, not in the other parts of the body. So I don't understand how these federal agents are working and who is guiding them and how they are being trained. Thomas.
Major General Sirohi, thank you so much for joining us here on NewsX World. A pleasure to talk to you as always. We now turn to our next story, and we go to Europe, France is launching an unusual campaign targeting 29-year-olds, sending them government letters encouraging them to think about having children before their fertility declines. Officials say the initiative is part of a broader 16-month plan to address the country's falling birth rate, which sits at about 1.56 children per woman, well below the 2.1 needed for population stability. The letters, due to be mailed nationwide by summer, will include balanced, science-based information on fertility, sexual and reproductive health, and options such as egg freezing, which in France is available free of charge through the health system for people aged 29 to 37. Health Minister Stephanie Rist says the aim is to educate rather than pressure citizens on when to start a family. The campaign is motivated by concerns that many people delay parenthood and later face fertility challenges. Critics, however, argue that reminders from the state risk infringing on personal choice and point to deeper socio-economic issues such as housing costs and childcare that influence decisions about having children. The government sees the outreach as one tool among many, including expanding fertility research and egg freezing centres to help reverse demographic decline and support future economic stability. Kosovo's parliament has elected Albin Kurti as Prime Minister for the third time, finally ending a year-long political gridlock. After spending 12 months as a caretaker, Kurti's party won December's snap election, securing him 66 votes in the 120-seat parliament. With his victory, Kurti pledged to focus on normalizing relations with Serbia, despite ongoing tensions, especially in the northern region. This step is crucial for both Kosovo and Serbia, as they both seek to progress towards European Union membership very soon. But that's all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more international news updates.